Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So, as well as the Tory client media producing a non-stop litany of articles decrying the introduction of VAT for private school fees, a number of private schools and some individuals decided to take the government to court over the policy. Long story short, they did not win. However, the judgment did appear to throw shade on Brexit, so I'm not sure how much money these entitled so-and-so spent on the court case, but worth it just for that. But first, for daily news and politics, please hit the subscribe button to stay notified. So I will start off by saying absolutely nothing wrong with taking the government to court to test the legality of some policy or other. Important part of democracy that we do not just assume that the government can do whatever it likes. An important part of democracy which is currently failing in the United States, for example. But the idea that the government does not have the legal power to set tax rates not only sounds ridiculous, but, as it turns out, is. Before I get onto the arguments, let's look at VAT first of all. Like value-added tax, it's what we call our sales taxes in Europe. It was enthusiastically supported when it was introduced in the UK in the 1970s by the Conservatives, because they liked the idea of indirect taxation on consumption rather than direct taxation on income. It allows you to load up more taxes on poorer people. The idea was that the essentials would be exempt, so food, fuel, housing. So it was essentially considered to be a tax on the consumption of things you didn't strictly need. So these days, like we have no VAT on staple foods like fruit, vegetables, meat and so on. Oddly though, there's no VAT on cake, but there is on biscuits. And that has created more than one legal case where it wasn't immediately obvious to everyone what was a cake and what wasn't. But then we have exemptions on children's clothes as well. Then VAT on fuel was actually applied. It's ended up being a tax where it's less to do with whether it's on a luxury or not and more to do with applying it according to where the government thinks it can get away with it, because most governments don't really like missing out on easy taxes as long as it doesn't cost them elections. But nobody can really make the case that private school is an essential. Some people have tried, however. I mean, it would be different if all schooling was privatised. If it was the case that everyone had to pay something for, just like a train fare, everyone had to pay something for the education of their children, even if it was subsidised, you could understand it then. But that's not the case. The reality is that every child in the UK has the right to state-funded education. If someone wants to send their spawn to a private school, that is their choice. Just like it's their choice to buy biscuits instead of cake. But it's not essential, it's a luxury. So why didn't we apply VAT to private school fees earlier? Well, VAT was brought in the first place to normalise taxation with the rest of the European community as we were joining. There is a common agreement on VAT application in the EU, including minimal levels for some things, but also exemptions. So as members of the EU, we weren't allowed to levy VAT on private school fees. In fact, during the judgment, the judges did say, it was a bit of a Brexit benefit, actually. So all those Brexiteers complaining in the Telegraph and the Mail have their own Brexit to thank for this. Not that it really is a Brexit benefit for a couple of reasons. First, we could have lobbied for a change to the rules. EU rules change all the time, and the UK was a major driving force behind many of the rules changes. If we were really bothered, we could probably have persuaded others that private education is a luxury in a country that provides universal state education. We could also definitely have persuaded the wider EU that VAT on safe feminine hygiene products is wrong and unfairly disadvantages women. We just didn't, that's all. Second, the amount being raised by the VAT on private school fees is less than £2 billion a year. The Treasury is missing out on about £40 billion a year as a result of the extreme Tory Brexit. Frankly, I'd rather wealthy parents continued with their unjustified tax break and we had an extra £38 billion a year to spend than the current situation. However, if you come across a Brexit supporter complaining about VAT on private school fees, it's very unlikely, but if you do, it's worth mentioning that it wouldn't have happened if we'd stayed in the EU, and those who voted to leave insist they know what they were voting for, so what's the complaint? So why did these schools and wealthy parents bring the case in the first place? What grounds did they think they had? Well, there were a few. I think the main argument seemed to be it was an attack on religious freedom. It was an attack on parental choice. It was an attack on special needs provision. So let's go through those. It's not an attack on religious freedom because no major religion in the UK commands its believers to send their children to private school. If you can't find a state school to give your child religious instruction, do it yourself. Most major religions have temples, which will put on lessons in most towns and cities as well. It's also not an attack on parental choice. First of all, the vast majority of parents who send their children to private school can still afford to do so, even with VAT added on top. And if the extra cost does price private education out of your budget, you're only in the same boat as someone on minimum wage who chooses to buy a Ferrari, but can't because they can't afford it. The special needs one was more worthy. There are some areas where a private school has good special needs provision, which does not exist in the surrounding state schools. However, the government did exempt the fees of VAT in some situations where a child has an education, health and care plan, and where it could be shown that the provision only existed in the private sector. So, in other words, the local authority was paying those fees anyway because it was the only way they could get that child those special needs provisions. So there was already an exemption for that. Mind you, those are just my reasonings. The court essentially decided to throw out all the arguments on the simple basis that there is nothing in law that gives anyone the right to private education or lower costs for private education on the basis that it might stretch your budget a bit. The whole thing was a farce, but it's now done with. Like I say, nothing wrong with bringing cases against the government to court. I support some of them myself. We need to make sure that the government are acting in accordance with the law, whether we agree with policies or not. But this one did seem frivolous from the start. And the policy is popular. The bottom line is about 7% are privately educated in the UK. That means a maximum of 7% of the population benefit from tax breaks on private school fees. And actually, tax breaks on private schools still exist, by the way. It's just the VAT tax break which was removed. However, it can't even be said that 7% suffer from this new policy because many of the people who send their children to private school are not just above the threshold where it's just about affordable. They are wealthy enough to pay the higher fees without even impacting their wider spending habits. Others also understand that the money is needed for state education. You know, the government made much of spending the money raised on breakfast clubs and expanding free school meals for kids going to state schools. This is popular, even amongst many who send their own children to private school. So there really are very few people who have a problem with the policy. It's just that their voices are amplified by a combination of support from the privately owned mainstream media, where much more than 7% send their children to private school, and the wealth which these people were able to use to press their case. After all, it's not a cheap thing to take the government to court, is it? Especially on a fool's errand such as this. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and for more content you could subscribe to the channel or join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.